Today, originality is prized in an almost obscene obsession, and the Duchess of Sussex has got caught up in what one might call pearl plagiarism and the pitfalls of modern reinvention. It's a curious and uncomfortable pattern that's emerging around the Duchess of Sussex, Meghan Markle. She's been accused repeatedly of borrowing rather too liberally from other people's work. And from her Netflix projects to her podcast, her speeches to her lifestyle branding, the accusations now form a catalogue rather than an incidental um, commission or omission or accident. Whether these are in fact mere coincidences, unconscious influences, or genuine lapses in due diligence is perhaps still up for debate. But the optics, as they say, are poor. And the most recent and the most detailed case is a thing called pearls of wisdom, or whatever you want to call it, pearls and pearl necklace. I don't know what sort of pearl she's thinking about. Announced in 2021 as part of a $100 million Netflix deal, this was an animated show that was going to feature a young girl inspired by historical female icons. Meghan was credited as the executive producer alongside David Furnish. It sounds uplifting, empowering, and on brand, but shortly after the fanfare, British author and illustrator Mel Elliott raised the alarm, and she'd already published 3 books in her Pearl Power series, beginning in 2014, featuring, you guessed it, a feminist little girl who also meets inspiring women from history. And Elliott had been developing an animated version herself as early as 2019. She sent legal letters, she sent personal letters, no reply. Netflix quietly axed the show and scrubbed it from Archwell's site. Yet the issue remains unresolved. Elliott, gracious but disappointed, notes, Meghan is a feminist who sticks up for other women, so I was confused to see something so similar to my own work. And it's not an isolated incident. Her podcast Archetypes bore a striking resemblance by name and theme to Caroline Miss's book, Archetypes, Who Are You? Her lifestyle brand, as ever, sparked criticism from a New York boutique and a Spanish mayor, both of whom claimed prior use of the name and, in the latter case, near-identical logo design. The Netflix cookery show, With Love, Meghan, was compared unfavourably to Pamela Anderson's Cooking with Love and Emma Weymouth's Emma's Kitchen. Even in her 2015 UN speech, and this is the point at which it starts to get really spooky, before royal life, she lifted a famous line from Eleanor Roosevelt, "It isn't enough to talk about equality, one must believe in it, and one must work at it." Roosevelt's original notably referenced peace, not gender. Each case on its own might seem trivial, and is trivial, but together they suggest a pattern of conceptual recycling that is at best careless. So is this plagiarism? Now, the problem is there's a legal and there's a creative issue at stake. Legally, perhaps not always, but intellectually it's much murkier material. So we have to acknowledge the nature of the creative world. Ideas are fluid, and inspirations are shared, and truly original concepts are vanishingly rare. But there is a line between imagination and imitation, and in Meghan's case, the recurring absence of citations, acknowledgements, or even courteous replies gives the impression, fair or not, of intellectual arrogance, if not intellectual theft. Phil Dampier, a royal commentator, describes these as schoolboy errors, gender accepted. But that lets the Duchess off too lightly. These are errors of professionalism, and they suggest a fundamental misunderstanding of what it takes to create something that is not only heartfelt but also legally and ethically sound. I remember years ago when I was working in another country, and I was asked if I would create a series of books, and I was told they have to be exactly like this but different. And I thought, this is a minefield. And repeatedly I was told to do exactly like this but different. Why is it not the same as this but different? Well, it can't be the same as this because that's plagiarism. Of course, accidental plagiarism also exists. With billions of books, shows, and slogans circulating in our collective unconscious, it's entirely possible to duplicate without intention. And that's why creatives, especially those with global reach, retain lawyers, researchers, and fact checkers. I have a system which I hope it works. I'll try and show you if I can. But I have everything on books. In books, I keep the same book for every for every week, and I just put everything in it. And so here on on one page, I have I think it's on the left hand side. I write what I've read, and on the right hand side, I add my own points. I'm just wondering if the problem is sometimes I've got so much rubbish in here, but a lot of the time it means that I can generally work out what's my thought and what is somebody else's thought. But there are points at which here's quite a good example here. What I read and my thoughts here, and I try to remain pretty consistent. I'm not always consistent. Sometimes I get it the wrong way round. But I try to make a distinction between what I read and my comments, and that's the main point. Because by the time you've sifted through a good number of books or a good number of newspapers, you've forgotten what is actually yours and what is actually somebody else's. And it's quite important to try to keep a record. And your notes all look the same, really. And Megan has access to the best. So when mistakes happen and no one apologizes or clarifies or acknowledges even the possibility of overlap, and for example, J.K. Rowling, her oeuvre of Harry Potter is filled with references which I think come from Ursula K. Le Guin. And of course the entire package is wrapped up in an environment really devised and marketed by J.R.R. Tolkien. Is it plagiarism? Probably not. Is it derivative? Absolutely. So, is it legally offensive? Probably not. Is it intellectually compromised? Certainly. And that's the point. Does she acknowledge it? Actually, I think she has acknowledged a debt to Ursula K. Le Guin, and I certainly wouldn't be alone in drawing that comparison. What's the difference in plagiarism and a tribute? In history, all the great artists plagiarized. Today we would call it plagiarism. In the past, they called it learning and apprenticeship. And it's a long time before you can move from copying to being original. And maybe today we don't do enough copying. Maybe today we prize originality in a way that is absurd. We stand in front of a class and we ask very small children to say something original. Nobody's got an original thought. It's all derivative. Whether or not it's legally compromised, whether or not it's legally questionable is another matter. But I don't think one's going to take a 6-year-old or a 10-year-old to court for copying something out of a book. I do a class with a number of quite small children, and I can hear them quoting things from ChatGPT. Occasionally they hand in work, and there are these long hyphens which are distinctive of ChatGPT. And you think, but I knew from the sound of what you were saying, and maybe I've never seen any of your work which hasn't come from ChatGPT, but I know it's not your voice. And it's the same thing that allows you to identify catfish online. And to a certain extent, when you see a catfish, or when you see a real catfish, apparently catching catfish is all about tickling them. And when you see somebody, or when you come across somebody online who is clearly fake, I feel you want to entertain them and encourage them and get them to say a little bit more about themselves. They rarely do. They just repeat the rubbish, and or dive deeper for cover. But if you can get to engage with them, you find a level of originality. You find a level of access, because it doesn't matter if somebody's pretending to be somebody else. They still have a voice, and they're still interesting. It's just you're engaging with somebody else, and perhaps it's time for Meghan Markle to pause. Ultimately, the issue is not, in this case, one of outright theft. I think it's one of stewardship. And Meghan and Harry's brand is built on values of integrity, of feminism, of voice. Yet these repeated missteps suggest a team that is either disorganized or dismissive of the very principles that they claim to champion. And I think it's time to reflect and to recalibrate. Originality is not just about avoiding other people's work, it's about honoring other people's work and recognizing the position that you've got in that trailblazing process. And if you stand for empowerment, as she says that she does, then you start by lifting up the women whose work came before. And otherwise, the risk isn't just about losing credibility, it's about losing the narrative entirely and dropping the baton. You know, that baton has been passed from person to person. And it's important. You don't need to acknowledge by name every single person that you have read, I suppose, but you do need to recognize that you stand on their shoulders. And I recognize every day, every morning I get up at 5:30, 6 o'clock, and I read through as many newspaper sources as I possibly can to get a grip on what's been going on over the last few hours during the night while I slept fitfully, actually. Last night I was up for some bizarre reason at 3 o'clock, and I don't know why. I thought it was 6. And it's, again, as I say, I make notes in one column, sometimes quite copious notes, and the pen goes across the page, and I know I'm writing for myself, but if I'm not careful, the two sides of the paper get intertwined, and I'm then confused. I don't have time to go back and read all the rubbish again, because much of it is repetitive, and I'm often foreign students ask me, "Oh, how can I improve my English? I read newspapers every day." And I say, well, that doesn't help you at all. Once you know the name Putin and Trump, you can read any rubbish. You've got to read novels, because novels have surprising and unexpected vocabulary. A newspaper has the same vocabulary no matter in what language you read it, no matter in what edition you read. It's basically the same story. And you might see 30 different sources for that story, but the majority of the journalistic guff uses the same vocabulary and the same terms of phrase. And in fact, if you look closely, you can see the briefing notes that lie behind the journalistic reports, and that I think is quite fun. And having spent much of my life trying to work out who wrote the first gospel, or who copied whom in the New Testament or the or Genesis, trying to do source criticism, it does pop up quite regularly when you're looking through newspapers and you're reading a bit of the Times and you think this is word for word from Reuters. Oh, this is very similar to what I just read in the Telegraph, or oddly in the Guardian. And then you look at Washington Post or something. Oh, come on, this is just somebody's copied somebody else. Who? And the attribution isn't there because there isn't the time, and much of it probably is not plagiarism. It's probably accidental. And then, of course, there are those people who plagiarize themselves. Oscar Wilde did it again and again and again. But, you know, we can repurpose the same lines. So perhaps we shouldn't be so quick to call it plagiarism and get a plagiarism checker out, which, in my experience, plagiarism checkers aren't very efficient, and AI checkers aren't very effective. I can remember writing a pile of stuff, and I can also remember watching somebody doing an exam, and we put both through a plagiarism through an AI check, and the AI insisted that the exam had been generated by AI, which I knew from watching the student doing the exam that it hadn't, and I thought that was interesting. So don't rely too much on these things that you pay lots of money for, because they're there to make money. They're not there to help you. They're there to make money. There is only one way to be sure that your work is not the work of a robot, and that's to write it. And even then, the various internet programs that you can sign up for, they want they want payment. They're going to identify AI wherever they possibly can. And you can put a text into one of these things one day, and it will say no AI identifiable, and then the next day it will say, oh yeah, 90% AI. It's poppycock. It's poppycock. There's only one way to find out, and that's to sit down and write it yourself. Meghan Markle needs to learn that, I'm afraid.